Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, we're starting the third session of the third topic of the semester titled The Rise of the Trading Empires. And in this session, we're going to continue looking at another series of trading empires that emerged from the 15 to the 1700s. Some of them are going to be centered in Europe and others in Asia. After we do that at the end, we're going to look into the global effects of the trading empires. That will be part three, devoted again to look at the different impacts of the trading empires in the world economy and world culture. Okay, so let us turn to our outline. And so far, just to remind you, we have looked at three major trading empires. Uh, in the first and second sessions, we were able to look at, for example, the Ottoman Empire centered in the Middle East. It pretty much created a trading system in the Eastern Mediterranean, capturing, of course, trade also in the Middle East and dominating, again, that region and forming a kind of roadblock to the European system. That actually pushed the Europeans to develop an alternative route to the Asian markets, and that led to the rise of both the Portuguese and the Spanish empires. Each of those empires were dominating certain trade routes, and they were moving into also different areas of the globe. We looked at how the Portuguese were moving into West Africa, developing trade there with kingdoms there in West Africa, Senegal, Congo, Angola, and they were also moving into the Indian Ocean as well, establishing choke points again in different locations, trying to dominate the trade there. The Spanish Empire is going to move westward, and we look at how the Spanish claimed the the credit of Columbus's discovery of America in 1492, and they're going to arrive to the New World. They're going to explore it, and they're going to stumble upon two large empires, the Inca and the Aztec empires. And there will be a massive conquest of those empires by the Spaniards. And subsequently, they're going to start establishing a series of mercantile enterprises. We looked at that, mining, silver mining, for example, plantations, the hacienda, for example. We were looking at that as well, and how the Spanish Empire was attempting to also create a monopolistic system by developing ports of imports and exports on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, let us proceed here in this discussion with another series of trading empires that are also going to start dominating certain areas of the globe in terms of trade. Now, again, this discussion centers mainly on trade, is not really looking at the process of colonization itself. This is something that we're going to look at in a future topic. There will be a whole section devoted to colonialism. But here, again, we're just really looking at trade initially. And this other empire also emerges in Europe, and those are the Dutch, again, Holland. They will also become an empire in their own right. As a matter of fact, they will become the dominant trading empire of Europe in the 1600s. Just like the Portuguese dominated the 1400s, particularly the Spanish, the 1500s, the Dutch will dominate the 1600s. And as we'll see, there will be a series of trading empires that are going to start arising almost simultaneously. The Dutch are at the helm of this process. Those are northern European kingdoms. Holland is one, but also France and England. They're going to start really moving into the outside slowly but surely. Now, before we get into the Dutch trading empire, I just want to point out at this point the mechanisms by which the Dutch, French, and British developed their trading systems and eventually their colonization efforts as well, something we're going to get to see in a future topic, as I mentioned, is that those kingdoms developed trading networks in different parts of the globe, not so much through the actions of their monarchs, which of course they were very much involved in this process, but rather here we're going to see the active participation of merchants. The merchants will be the ones in charge of this process. They are going to pretty much dominate uh, the process by which they're going to start moving out of Europe and establishing trading outposts in different parts of the world. And they're going to start dominating certain trade routes and also trading arrangements with different societies again. And they're going to be the ones involved in this process again. So in Holland, France, and England, we're going to see how merchants are coming together to form joint stock companies, and eventually they will receive a charter from their kings to operate overseas on behalf of the kingdom. Okay, so we're going to see the formation of trading companies. Again, those are international, really international trading companies that will have a legal right, a legal entitlement, a legal permit by their rulers to operate in different parts of the world. So again, this is not just merchants getting together and just doing this willy-nilly, again, just sailing around the world and establishing their own trading outpost. They do have permission, to operate overseas by their kings. Okay, so this is quite a different process that we see that distinguishes itself from the one that we looked at, in the past by the Portuguese, the Spanish, and also the Ottoman as well, in which the kings were very much involved in this process. In many cases, there were certain, alliances made with merchants and so on, but the kings were very much involved in this process as well. But here, the trading companies are in total control of moving out into the world and trying to develop networks in different areas of the world. Okay, trading companies. So let's look at those trading companies. We start with the Dutch, and the Dutch moving to international trade and start building their trading companies initially as the result of the Dutch serving as aids in many cases to the Portuguese. They were excellent sailors, and in many cases, when the Portuguese, when they were moving into West Africa or the Indian Ocean, they did not have enough personnel in order to conduct all their trading activities. So what they will do is that they will subcontract, so to speak, other Europeans that were very skilled, in the sea, navigators, and the like. And so the Dutch were serving as the seamen, if you will, for the Portuguese. They were providing very valuable assistance, once again, in operating the vessels and helping the Portuguese carry goods from one part of the world to another. So they really learned from this experience significant knowledge about the sea itself. They are learning about wind currents and ocean currents and the trade routes, and they're really, again, building up their own knowledge about world maps of oceans and continents. And at some point, they're going to go independent. This is going to really provide them everything that they needed in order to start forming their own independent companies, their own independent ventures. So this is the background, so to speak, for the Dutch to start now forming their own trading companies. I mean, they do have capital. They come together, they merge that capital, and they form a trading company and receive a charter from their rulers. And one of the first ones to arise, one of the first companies, was the Dutch East India Company. The purpose of this company was to move into the Indian Ocean to tap into the Asian markets, pretty much. Spices, and silks, ceramics, textile. Okay. So again, the idea is to circumnavigate Africa, moving to the Indian Ocean, the Southeast Asian market as well in Southeast Asia, and eventually the China Sea as well. I mean, this is really, again, their ambitions. As you can see in this map, the Dutch East India Company developed a series of trade networks, something that they learned from the Portuguese, and now they're using it for their own advantage. And as we'll see, as we move into the 1600s, the Portuguese will start to lose ground in the Indian Ocean. That monopolistic system that they tried to implement was not working any longer, and now they're facing a more powerful force, the Dutch, who are replacing them slowly but surely as the dominant European power that was trading in this network. Okay, so keep that in mind. The Dutch are now dominating that century, the 1600s, and the trade. Once again, it is a trade that is highly profitable. We're dealing particularly with the spice trade. I mean, the spices are just a commodity that in Europe is having an enormous success. There's a great demand for them. But of course, there are other commodities that they're also trading. They're also buying from the uh, Indian or Chinese merchants and that are exporting massive quantities again of manufactured goods, etc. But spices is at the very center of the trade for the Dutch. And since spices was something that was grown on a massive scale in the Southeast Asian islands, there's a series of islands, as you can see here, like Java, Sumatra, Malay, for example. There's an archipelago of islands, as you can see, just north of Australia. Again, this is the region per excellence where we see producers, farmers, and peasants, again, just growing spices for the world, more so than in India. I mean, India was also growing spices, but in reality, this is the place that was generating the vast majority of the spices for the world market. India was excellent in producing black pepper, for example. But here, the islands of this region were producing things like, for example, cardamom, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, for example, uh, just various spices that people uh, ground and mix together and use for dishes, for example, okay, to create stews and so on. And so this is the region that produces those spices. So as a result of that, the Dutch are going to start dominating certain islands and trying to build a major center of operations there. Okay. And they do seize control of an island which was really critical for this spice trade. And that's the island of Java. Okay, so Java, as you can see in this map right here, becomes the headquarters for the Dutch East India Company. And there, what we see is that as they're collecting spices from the different islands, they arrive there, and from Java, they move into the Indian Ocean and then all the way to Europe. Okay, so it becomes a major trading center for the Dutch, controlling the spice trade. Now, as we have seen, every trading empire was at the same time that was establishing trading outposts and so on in different parts of the world, dominating certain commodities, for example. They were also trying to implement certain monopolistic practices or strategies. We looked at the Ottomans, for example, preventing trade between Asia and Europe, dominating the prices of the spices, for example. The Portuguese and the choke points, we looked at that, the license systems, and so on. Um, so every empire was attempting to do that, and the Dutch were no different. So The Dutch were also trying to control prices. Again, they knew that at some point it would be extremely difficult to dominate the entire spice trade, but they are trying to engage in price fixing, trying to again establish certain prices. So it was important to maintain a certain level of supply, never to exceed that supply level, never to flood the market with so much product. They were trying to kind of regulate it, in other words. But what they found out is that because this was a highly trafficked area where there were other merchants that were trading spices, suddenly in Europe, we're going to see an overproduction, an overflow of spices moving into Europe. Again, there's smuggling taking place. There are other empires that are bringing spices into Europe, not only the Dutch. And that's a fact. So, how the Dutch were attempting to deal with the problem of overproduction, which was really affecting prices, because whenever there's an oversupply of anything which exceeds the demand of that product, then the prices come falling down again eventually. That is pretty much the rule in the market. Okay, there's a supply and demand, but if there's more of that supply than there's demand, then the price goes down and there's no profit there. So this started affecting the interest of the Dutch in East India Company as prices began to fall down as a result of overproduction. The islands were just producing and exporting so much. So one of the mechanisms that the Dutch implemented in order to deal with this problem was by dealing with the local populations more directly and more forcefully. Okay, they were trying to convince them not to grow much, not to export that product again in excess, but the local population of the different islands again just did not comply. Okay, for them, there was a demand for the spices. They were getting merchandise or payments in return, and all they wanted was to export more. So, one of the strategies or so called solutions that they implemented was by being, again, more aggressive towards those local producers. And what they will do is that they will invade an island where there was, again, massive overproduction and exports, and they will seize the population and relocate it and send them to other islands, that were barren, nothing will grow there, in other words. This is called relocation. They will relocate populations from one island to another in order to deal with the problem, in order, again, to create a kind of an artificial scarcity in the system, in other words. Okay? And when that didn't work because there was resistance, again, there will be open confrontation, something we saw, for example, with the Aztecs and the Incas confronting the Spaniards. And in this case, the Dutch also quite aggressively move against them, and they will just totally annihilate the population, from that island. Again, it was kind of the mechanism, in other words, to maintain prices at a stable level. And again, this was a very, very aggressive kind of policy that the Dutch carried out in Southeast Asia. Okay, relocation on one hand, but also annihilation as well of the producers. Okay, now the Dutch merchants, besides tapping into the Asian markets, they will also set their eyes west across the Atlantic Ocean. During this time, the French had already arrived. We're going to talk about the French in just a few moments. And the French were already establishing, a company there in North America, Eastern Canada, for the fur trade. And they don't want to fall behind, the fur trade, which was also quite profitable as well. And they're going to create a company of merchants that will operate in North America. They created what is called the New Netherland Company, as you can see in this map. That includes the Manhattan Island, Long Island, and what is today the present day state of New York. All of that area used to be Dutch company, okay, a Dutch trading company called the New Netherland Company. It was constituted by a society of merchants coming from Amsterdam. So in many cases, that company was dubbed as New Amsterdam as well, because most of the settlers and of course the owners of the company came from Amsterdam, and they arrived in order to engage in trade with the Native American groups of the region. Those were actually Algonquian native tribes. Now, the Algonquian tribal groups of North America uh, was a conglomeration of a wide array of different linguistic groups that shared common ancestors. Their languages were related. It was the Algonquian language that was broken up into a series of dialects, in other words. Okay, and there were many different tribal groups that spoke aspects of Algonquian, in other words. And they're going to become major partners to the Dutch in the fur trade, and they're the ones that were moving out into the wilderness to hunt the beaver, this animal from which the furs were extracted. There was a great market in Europe for furs. People were paying gold and silver, particularly the merchants, the artisans, members of the elite, the nobility. Again, there was a great market for that. So again, we see another trading company operating in North America. This is Dutch. Once again, now, because those Native American groups are now participating in this global network, I mean, without knowing, perhaps they are now exporting a major product to the world market. Remember, the world is becoming a marketplace. And now what we see is certain Native American groups are engaged in this process. They're the ones actually generating a product, in this case first, that leave that region and moves into the world. Okay. There's going to be intense competition between the Native American tribal groups over the trade, because the Dutch exchange merchandise for those furs. They bring in things like, for example, clothing. They bring iron works, iron tools, hardware that the Native Americans need. In many cases, gunpowder, weapons as well, and the like, horses as well. And eventually, as we'll see, the Native Americans will adopt the horse. This is, again, something that the Europeans introduced. And again, this is going to lead to warfare because the Native Americans are now armed, if you will, and they are competing with other Native American groups in the region for the control of the fur trade. They want to become the major suppliers of the furs to the Dutch. And we're going to see, of course, intertribal warfare emerging. And one of those groups, the Mohawks, which were really a warrior clan, is going to emerge triumphant, and they're going to displace the Algonquian native traders, and they're going to now become the dominant force in the region, the major partners of the Dutch in the fur trade. And also they provide military service as well to the Dutch. That's another thing. Again, that this is not just a commercial partnership, it's also a military alliance as well. Now, obviously, there will be conflict with the Dutch, and not only with the Dutch. Every major European power that arrives in North America will also, have their own problems with the native groups that they're dealing with. And one of the major sources of problems and issues with the Native Americans was over concepts of land ownership, how we claim land, for example. Obviously, the Europeans bring in the concept of private property, that, this idea that individuals can actually purchase the land and own it, for example. That's the European concept, private property and so on. Uh, Now, the Native Americans do not really understand that concept, how humans can actually own the land. Okay, we can occupy a land, we can extract resources from the land, we can hunt, we can fish, we can grow crops. Maybe that's something we can own, whatever products we extract, but the land itself cannot be owned. It can be shared by different people, at the same time or at different times. And one of the ways that tribal groups allowed other tribal groups to make use of the land was by the use of what is called gift giving, providing, for example, gifts to the tribal chief of a group was a way to create an alliance with that tribal group and create a partnership for both groups to use the land. That did not entail abdicating the territory. That did not entail, well, I just sold you the land because I accepted your gifts, so I now need to leave, for example. And again, the Dutch expected that. Whenever they deliver, for example, gifts to tribal groups, they believed that they were actually really buying the land. Look, I'm giving you something of value for this territory, and now we want to use the territory for our own needs. And the tribal groups will get the merchandise, but they will not abdicate the territory because this is part of their custom. Yeah, so we welcome you. You can stay here now. You can use the land, just use the resources. But again, the Dutch expected them to leave, and that created, of course, frictions with the Dutch, and it will be a major source of contention. Between the natives and the Europeans that are establishing trading relations, okay, in that region. The other trading empire I want to discuss here is the French Empire. And once again, this is an empire that also creates their own trading companies of merchants, receiving charters from their kings to operate overseas. And the French are also trying to move into the Indian Ocean, so they create their own East India Company. This is the French East India Company. Okay, just like the Dutch, they are also trying to tap into the Asian markets, the spice trade, for example. But they're going to be moving into other commodities as well. It's not just going to be spices, as we'll see. We're going to be looking at, for example, tea, textiles and silks. Again, it's a wide variety of different exotic goods, which they're going to be selling in Europe, but they're also going to be selling it in the New World as well. A major provider, again, of those commodities in the New World as well. Again, so we see competition on the rise. The Dutch dominate the 1600s, but the French are also rising up to the occasion, and they become a major rival as well to the Dutch. Okay, so as you can see in this map, the Dutch are moving into the ancient markets. They're establishing also trading relationships in different parts of the world, particularly India in this case. They arrive to India and they establish a major trading outpost in that region. In 1674, it became known as Pondicherry. Pondicherry, again, this is the trading outpost that the French establish in India, and it becomes a major center of French trade in Asia. Again, just like Java was the major center of operations for the Dutch, here what we see is the French developing, again, a major center in the southern portion of India. Okay, as you can see, again, in this map, this is where Pondicherry is located in southern India. And over time, this trading outpost will be transformed into a colonial territory that the French will claim. They will build some form of colonial possession here. It's not going to last very long, but they are indeed moving already into the Indian subcontinent, slowly but surely, gradually. So this is not yet outright colonization. Again, this is just the stepping stones towards starts opening up the system. The French are moving into the Indian Ocean, and they're like supplicants, just trying to build trading relations with the Indian merchants, for example, and they're trying to become preferred customers of local goods for exports, and they're kind of moving in as equals, with the Indian partners in this case. Okay, so again, this is not yet outright colonization. What the French become very interested of in India, besides spices and tea, black tea, which is really having an enormous success both in Europe and also in North America, and black tea, uh, is silk and cotton fibers. Here they realize that artisans in India are very, very well organized, and they have been very well organized uh, uh, ever since the times of the Ashoka, for example, empire, centuries before Christ. Uh, we talked about guilds, for example, guilds, the merchant guilds and the guilds of the artisans. Again, India have had guilds of artisans. Those are again communities or organizations, fraternities of artisans that have come together, and they protect each other, they share knowledge, they control prices, they also control quality and the like. Again, so they're very, very well organized. And their fabrics are just excellent as well, what they produce, because of the high standards of quality that they set for themselves. And this is something that was really admired by the French, and this is going to find a great market in Europe. The Indian textiles, for example, okay, those fabrics. And what we're going to look at here is, because of the great demand for those fabrics in Europe, the French are exporting massive quantities of fabrics out of India, to the point that we're going to see the rise of local manufacturing in India. Now, this is not necessarily the kind of an industrial revolution that we saw, for example, later on in Europe in the 1700s in England, with the mills and the weaving machines. This is not really a mechanized process. No machines are really involved necessarily here. Everything is done manually. This is, again, artisans weaving by hand, in other words. Okay, there are a series of villages in this region of India, in South India, that are becoming centers of manufacturing. Again, there will be thousands and thousands of artisans weaving, again, textile for exports. So one of the impacts, as we'll see again, of the trading empires is having already an impact here, is the development of local manufacturing, something we saw, for example, in West Africa as well, with the African textiles. This is something, very, very similar, a parallel that we see here now in India. The same thing, the rise of local manufacturing, again, because there's a demand for a local product. People are willing to bring in merchandise or gold and pay, good quantities for those commodities. And now people are accommodating to that global market. Okay. So again, the economies are changing now. People are no longer producing for their own village or for their own region. They're producing for the world. Something we saw also with the Dutch in North America, with the Algonquian tribes, for example. They're now producing first for the world market as well. Okay. All right. So the French will also set their eyes to the West, across the Atlantic. They are moving in as well. And as I mentioned, the French will be the forerunners of colonization of North America. Even before the Dutch arrived, the French were the forerunners, the first ones to start establishing trading outposts, and eventually they're going to build a very large trading company. It'll be known as the Royal Company of New France. Okay, it all started in Quebec, in eastern Canada. The French merchants began arriving as early as the 1540s to that region, and they're really creating also partnership and trading alliances with the tribal groups of Eastern Canada. As you can see, this is going to be a vast uh, territorial domain of this company. Again, a vast territorial domain that encompassed Eastern Canada, the Great Lakes, the Great Plains of what today is the United States, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. They eventually, by the end of the 1600s, they're going to build an international port in the Gulf of Mexico. That was the port of New Orleans. Again, all of that constituted a vast domain that belonged to the Royal Company of New France. Again, it is a company of merchants, and the king also of France has participation, is a stockholder as well of the company as well. Okay. Now, the major commodity that the company is exporting is fur. Again, the furs of the beaver. Again, and the Native American groups that the French encounter, there will be a multiplicity of them. The Hurons, for example, of Eastern Canada will be the first ones to establish trading relations with let me just write it here, with the French, and they become the major participants, in the trapping, in the extraction of the pelts of the beaver and so on. They're the ones that actually exchange the fur for European merchandise, just like with the Dutch. It's very, very similar. They're obtaining merchandise like clothing and iron tools, weaponry and the like. Again, but eventually, the French are going to extend their networks into the Great Lakes, the Great Plains, and along the Mississippi River, just because they were exhausting the beaver population in every region. Again, the demand for furs in Europe was insatiable. So that led to the rapid depletion of this animal species in different parts of North America, and that led the French to pursue other regions. And as they're moving across North America, they're building, of course, alliances with the Native Americans. And one of the mechanisms to build an alliance with a Native American tribal group was by engaging, once again, in something called gift giving, a gift giving policy. Now, this is a Native American practice. This is a Native American tradition that in order to befriend a tribal group, you need to meet the chief and present a series of gifts to that chief, and there you bond. In other words, you create a treaty, a pact, which can be commercially oriented or military or otherwise. Again, you're really coming together as partners, and in that way, the French were really building a network of commercial partnerships across the region that gave them access to the resources, but at the same time, the French believed that they were also building an empire in North America by virtue of bringing in the Native American groups to the French Empire, that they were indeed turning the natives into French subjects. Because under French law, again, the idea is that if you become an ally of France, let us just say some Native American groups become allies of the French, they are by default becoming subjects of the King of France, in other words. And this is further reinforced if those natives convert to Catholicism as well. Okay, so the French, what they were attempting to do is building commercial partnerships through this idea or practice called gift giving, but at the same time, they were sending thousands of missionaries into the frontier and trying to spread Catholicism far and wide to trying to convert as many Native Americans, because that will also, by virtue of conversion, turn them into subjects as well. And if they were subjects of France, then their territory becomes part of the French Empire as well. Okay, so this is another mechanism that they were attempting to gain some form of monopoly over the fur trade. Again, doing those two strategies. Now, what is very interesting to note is that those Native American groups that interacted the most with the French, particularly in Canada, in Eastern Canada, are undergoing cultural change. Again, we see a cultural transformation taking place in Eastern Canada. We see the rise of a hybrid culture. The natives, some of them convert to Catholicism, although their version of Catholicism is very native. The natives also adopt certain customs of the French. They learn French. They dress like the French, but also the French merchants, the pioneers, adventurers, and settlers are also going native. They intermarry with the native local populations and they eat the foodstuffs of the natives. They participate in their ceremonies. So again, we see really a hybrid culture on the rise. Again, this is extremely important that part of the interaction of the trading empires lead to a merge of customs and cultures as well, as we can see here in North America. Okay. Now, the British is the last European kingdom to step into the world stage, so to speak, and transform their simple kingdom into a major trading empire. And as we'll see, they will become the dominant force in the 1800s. Okay. So the Portuguese dominated the 1400s, the Spanish the 1500s, the Dutch the 1600s, the French the 1700s, and the British the 1800s. Even though the British start building their trading empire as early as the 1600s, they're not going to become dominant and powerful until the 1800s. Now, just as we saw with the Dutch and the French, the British were also societies that are coming from a background of having experienced nomadic invasions in the past. You know, whether we're talking about the Germanic tribal groups of Central Europe or the Vikings of Northern Europe, again, that helps explain the nature of those empires, that the leadership, again, of those empires were actually the heirs of those nomadic groups that invaded and raided those regions. Okay, now they're in control, again, of those entities. In other words, the British were no exception. For example, you know, the British constituted a society of Germanic groups that populated the British Isles even before the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, and even after the fall of the Roman Empire, the British Isles were invaded by a series of Germanic tribes, which were nomadic and warlike. Britain was invaded by the Vikings, the Normans, as they were called, you know, the Viking invasion of England. Those were actually nomadic as well. And they were also excellent navigators as well. So again, their skills of warfare, their skill of navigation will merge with the local populations of the British Isles, and we're going to see a new kind of entity, so to speak, an entity that by the 1500s, as the British are now moving into international trade, they are bringing with them those two traditions. Again, the nomadic tradition of warfare, for example, on one hand, and also their skills of the sea as well as navigators as well. And one of the initial stepping stones for the British to step into the world market, so to speak, you know, participating as a major force in international trade, was engaging in piracy, as a matter of fact, as a form of trade warfare in the 1580s. Something, again, that we can actually trace back as early as the 1540s, as a matter of fact, when we see that in England, as a result of conflicts in Europe between England and Spain over religion. You know, England had gone Protestant, Spain is staunch Catholic. So we see religious rivalries between the different kingdoms of Europe, Protestant and Catholic. The British monarchs were sponsoring, you know, trade warfare against the Spanish. You know, the Spanish were carrying silver and gold from the New World, and they will cross through the Caribbean and then move all the gold and the silver to Spain. And well, what the British monarchs were doing is that they were incentivizing uh, individuals who had means. In this case, those were merchants, and at the same time, they had their own personal fleets. They were called privateers. Again, it's almost like mercenaries, like private, if you will, soldiers, mercenaries who had their own naval fleet, a small naval fleet, for example, um, to move into the Caribbean and actually raid the ships that the Spanish controlled in the region, carrying gold, and steal the gold and bring it to England. In other words, Sir Francis Drake was one of those famous characters. Again, a famous pirate. Again, that was a privateer. He was subcontracted by the monarchy to conduct those raids against the Spanish in the Caribbean. Again, this led to today, the creation of films like, the Pirates of the Caribbean, for example. Okay, so it all started, as piracy as a form of trade warfare, trying to really break the monopoly of the Spaniards, in other words, in the New World, and hurt their interest at the same time. But as we move into the 1600s, the British are getting very, very serious, and although their piracy will continue, even into the 16 and parts of the 1700s, now the British are ready to start really now formalizing their trading activities by forming their own version of the East India companies, for example, that we saw with the Dutch and the French. We see the emergence of those trading companies in England, okay? And they create, in 1600, the British East India Company. They're all named East India Company. One is Dutch, other French, and this is British, okay? The British East India Company. This is going to be the most important trading company of the British Empire, as a matter of fact. Not only the most important, it will become the largest company in the world. It actually was the forerunner of the modern day corporation, the British East India Company. Again, it will be even more and more all encompassing than the Dutch and the French, okay, over time. Okay. It had, of course, established in the 1600s centers of operation, those are trading outposts, particularly in India. Again, it is really centered in India. Again, so this is not yet outright colonization. The British East India Company is not arriving to colonize India at this time. India at this time is dominated by another empire. We're going to get to see in just a few moments the Mughals, for example. So they are arriving just like the French as equals, as supplicants, trying to just gain a foothold in India in order to start exporting, black pepper, for example, teas, black teas, and other products, textiles as well. So they established a series of trading outposts, for example, in Surat in 1612. You can see here in this map, in the western section, the western seaboard, in Madras in 1639, Bombay 1668, and Calcutta in 1690. Okay, so there are four major trading outposts that they established, and those were the places from which the British East India Company was exporting, once again, spices, tea, and cotton textiles. Again, this is the time when tea was becoming very, very popular in Europe, particularly in England and in the British colonies as well. The British are establishing also a series of colonies in North America, and black tea will become one of the major commodities consumed in England. There will be, again, tea houses and tea shops everywhere in England, for example. And so we see the rise of a tea culture. So there was a great, again, success of this company with tea, and it will become central, as we'll see. So it's not just spices. I know tea is becoming very, very much central. Also, the cotton textiles. Again, the textiles are also in great demand in England, and that led to, once again, the expansion of local manufacturing in England as well, just like with the French. In Pondicherry, in South India, we see the same thing occurring in those regions, that the British India Company is establishing their base of operations, and they also become major tribute providers. They pay tribute to the local chieftains, the princes that dominate those regions as well. So once again, they're not yet colonizing, they're barely getting into the market, and they're even paying tribute at the same time. Now, just like the French and the Dutch, the British will also set their eyes to North America. As I explained, they are attempting to also establish trading operations in North America. And this is going to be the foundations for their colonization process. They're going to be building a series of colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America. So how it all started is by creating companies, trading companies to operate in North America. They create three companies. One was called the Virginia Stock Company. It was created by a company of merchants in London, again, to establish trading outposts initially for the fur trade. Again, they're all interested in the fur trade. And merchants from Plymouth in England create the Plymouth Company and the Massachusetts Bay Companies in order to also extract furs in North America. Eventually, when those companies were established, the Virginia Stock Company is now changing their nature of operations from fur extraction, which they rarely find there in that region, to the production of tobacco. Okay, so this is going to become a tobacco company, again, for the British Empire. Again, tobacco was grown in Virginia for the British Empire, whereas in Plymouth, in Massachusetts, for example, Bay Companies, there we see, of course, the beaver being abundant, and so therefore the fur trade will become the major commodity exported to England, and also lumber as well for building ships and furniture, etc. Back in England, there's going to be manufacturing again, and lumber will be one of the major resources extracted out of Massachusetts. Okay, so the British are also setting a foothold in North America, and they're also establishing trading relationships with the Native American tribal groups that they encounter. Well, they needed, of course, the Native American tribal groups to actually initiate their communities, to establish their outposts, and the like. So in Virginia, for instance, the British settlers that established Jamestown, for example, the capital of the company there in that region, the very first tobacco plantations were assisted by the Powhatan Confederation. It was really a large confederation or alliance of tribal groups that shared common ancestors. Let us just say the Powhatan. They're called the Powhatan. They were led by a chief who himself was called the Powhatan as well. He was the leader of the Powhatan as well. And at first, there was assistance. Again, the Powhatans actually guided the settlers in terms of, teaching them how to farm, corn and beans and the like, and fish, kind of just survival skills, for example. But over time, of course, both groups became suspicious of one another, and they were trying to struggle for power. Okay, and each side was implementing different strategies that they considered to be pretty much accepted by the standards of their own society. Okay, for example, from the British perspective, the way to bring the Powhatan Confederation, which numbered to like about 20,000 people, it was a vast network of tribal groups. Again, the way to bring them into the British Empire, to turn them into British subjects, to be guided by British law, for example, was to turn the chief, Powhatan, into a vassal of the King of England. So they invited him for a ceremony, which was common again back in Europe. The king, for example, under feudalism, can have vassals. We talked about that. Feudalism, and there's a ceremony of submission, whereby the vassal or the knight will submit to the king, will bow down and kneel, and the king will simply, in a ceremony say, "You're from this point onwards, my knight, and you will fight for me," and so on. So you serve me, and so on. So the British settlers were trying to do this with Powhatan, invited him to kneel, to bend the knee, in other words, and to be given as one crown, the crown of a vassal, to turn him into a vassal, in other words. And by doing that, to really turn the entire confederation into British subjects. Now, the natives do not understand what's really going on. Powhatan doesn't want to vow to the English settlers because, from his perspective, that was really an act of submission. So he doesn't really want to submit, in other words, to the newcomers. So again, there was a confusion there. There is a struggle for power. Now, Powhatan is also trying to do the same thing to the British. He's trying to turn them into members of his confederation. And according to the Powhatan tradition, the way to turn a tribal group into a client, if you will, member of the confederation was by intermarriage. If you marry, for example, the daughter of the chief to the son of another chief, by doing that marriage, you're bringing that tribal group into the alliance, and the chief that conducted the ceremony and arranged the marriage is going to now be the chief of all the newcomers. Again, this new group that has become integrated as well. Again, so that led, of course, to the marriage of Pocahontas, for example, with John Wolfe. Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, is being given to the English settlers to marry them, with the idea that by doing that, by marrying the daughter to the English settlers, that he was actually bringing all those English settlers to his confederation as well. So again, there is, of course, a bid for power. Now, the other strategy was to evangelize the natives. The English settlers believe that the natives need to be converted to Christianity. They are indeed, pagans. They need to turn to Christianity to save their souls. And that's another way to try to change their culture as well. Again, so there is this process of evangelization as well, not only to the Powhatans, but also in the upper trading companies, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, the Puritans that ended up settling in the territories of those companies bring with them this idea that it was important to evangelize the Native American tribal groups that they're dealing with in the fur trade, the Algonquians, for example. So there will be an effort to convert the natives, again, in order to bring them into English culture as well. Again, we are, partners with them, we're training with them in the fur trade, but at the same time, it will be very, very practical to also convert, their culture and their religion. And again, there's going to be an intense effort as well to evangelize as well. This is something we have seen in the past, for example, when the Spanish are engaged in this spiritual conquest of the New World. Again, it's pretty much building missions and trying to Christianize the natives. So the British attempt a trade monopoly, and the way they're trying to do this is by, again, restricting trade. They pass a series of laws called the Navigation Acts, again, and they restrict trade between their colonies in North America and the mother country as well. Again, so they are trying to tighten the system in order to restrict, of course, other merchants from participating as well, as you can see, very similar to what the Spanish were doing at the same time. Now, in Africa, the Dutch, the French, and the British are also trying to gain a foothold there in West Africa for the control of the slave trade. The great dying in the Americas that we saw, the Native American population led to the need for labor and to work in the sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, for example, in the New World, to grow things like rice and cotton and the like. And that led the Europeans to form companies to move into West Africa to export that labor for the American plantations. So we're going to see the development of a slave trade. And the slave trade was conducted primarily by trading companies, again, like the Dutch West India Company, formed in 1621, the Royal African Company in 1663, and the French Senegal Company in 1677. Once again, those are companies that receive a charter to go into West Africa and, again, deal with the West African kingdoms that provide trading outposts to those companies. Those trading outposts given to those companies were known as the barracoons. And again, they anchor the ships there. The trading companies, they await the arrival of slaves that the West African kingdoms are, giving them. The West African kingdoms receive weaponry again from the Europeans, and then they move into the mainland, and they move inland as far as 1,000 miles, and they raid communities and they capture people and then bring them to the coast. And there's a trade with those companies again, an exchange of merchandise, so to speak, European merchandise for African slaves. So again, this is going to intensify the slave trade, as we'll see, between West Africa and Europe. And there will be, of course, a triangular system that connected Europe, West Africa, and America. And in the entire process of the slave trade, there will be about 12 million slaves that were exported to America, about 12 million from the 1400s all the way to the abolition of the slave trade in the 1800s. Now, the other empire I want to discuss is the Mughal Empire, again, that emerges in 1526. This is, again, a group of Turks with Mongols. They're Islamic, by the way, that conquered India in 1526 under the leadership of Babur. And they established a large territorial domain. Again, this is the Mughal Empire in India, as you can see. And they're responsible for introducing Islamic civilization in India. Now, initially, one of the emperors, Akbar, again, introduced a method for governing the Indian subcontinent by providing, again, tolerance to the Hindus, again, respecting Hindu religious beliefs and traditions and ceremonies in order to really centralize authority. In other words, for him, it was not going to be practical to force people to convert to Islam. So he was, at least, again, him, very, very tolerant towards the Hindu population. He implemented an imperial administration in which the people that aided the conquest, known as the Mansadvars, for example, were given rights to exploit certain populations and extract tribute. In other words, those would be the imperial administrators, part of the imperial army, like the conquistadors, for example, giving them land grants in order to actually extract tribute once again. And also, again, to collect tribute for the emperor as well. Now, this is a trading empire, and they are indeed controlling the textiles. Remember, they're producing silk and cotton for the French and for the British, and they're the ones pretty much in control of that, promoting local manufacturing, the emergence of local manufacturing. They're also promoting the growth and exports of black pepper, and they're trying to control the Indian Ocean. The spices that arrive from Southeast Asia, for example, they're going to transship those spices to Europe and charge a higher fee as well. So they are indeed controlling that network, the Indian Ocean, the network there. China is the last series of empires, again, that we're going to get to see here. And here, what we see is that the Chinese, after the fall of the Mongol Empire in 1368, receives a new dynasty. It's called the Ming Dynasty. In 1368, it will rule China until 1644. And China kind of becomes more inward oriented. They're not going to be really in pursuit of dominating, for example, the world market. They are indeed engaged in a process of exploration and commerce. They build a very large fleet. It was called the Treasure Fleet in 1421. It really constituted about 3,500 ships. So it was a grand fleet, but it was not a fleet for conquest or for dominating choke points in different parts of the network. and trying to dominate trade. This was more of an exploration, so to speak. And one of the most memorable voyages was conducted by Admiral Senhead, for example. For example, that led a series of voyages into the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. And he was just collecting information, like an explorer, information about culture, customs, traditions, and the like, just building pretty much a database in this case. So they're not going to really create an empire with it. As a matter of fact, in 1525, this fleet is going to be destroyed by the Chinese emperors because people complained in China that the merchants were gaining so much power, and in China the merchants are not appreciated. They're not. Again, they believe that they're like parasites. The merchants, and so in order to prevent the merchants from seizing control of China, they destroy the fleet. So again, this was a very faithful move that pretty much destroyed the possibility of China to become a major player in world trade. Okay, so they're becoming more and more focused on the domestic economy, and they're promoting agriculture. The agrarian ideal. Being a peasant is the ideal. In other words, growing crops. Promoting commercial agriculture in China. We got new products coming from the New World: corn, peanuts. Again, there'll be now new crops added to the Chinese diet. This is what Chinese peasants are growing, and of course, silk production for exports. And that led to an increase, really an explosion of population. China by 1600 is reaching now 175 million, because of this new commercial agriculture. And of course, this is the time when the Europeans are arriving in great numbers, and they're establishing outposts in the South China Sea, and they're labeled as the new barbarians. Again, the new barbarians are arriving. Something we're going to get to see again in a future topic, the relationship between the so-called the new barbarians, the Europeans, and the Chinese. Part 3, again, very quickly, we're going to look at the global impacts of the trading empires. What were the impacts of the trading empires? Again, we're going to get to see different, impacts. For example, one is the Silver Revolution. And then this is, again, the impact that the silver that the Spanish extracted on a massive scale is going to have on the European system, but also on the Asian system as well. It was just so much silver extracted out of the Americas and sent into Europe, particularly to Spain, for example. And from Spain is going to flood the market all over Europe, as Spain is actually buying, for example, manufactured goods, hardware, and so on, ships, again, from the Dutch, from the British, from other powers, again. That silver is going to start flowing elsewhere across Europe, and it will become really Europe's first monetary system. That now, for the first time, all over Europe, the currency that ordinary people, are going to use for ordinary day-to-day transactions, for buying and selling products in local markets, will be silver coins. Again, so this is really monetizing, really, the European economy, for example. And that led, of course, to a price revolution, because it was just so much silver flowing into the European economy that this is going to lead to inflation, a rise in prices, in other words, because there was just so much money, in other words, into the economy, chasing fewer goods. And when we have that, more money, again, chasing fewer goods, we have, of course, a rise in prices as well. And so, again, this is something new in European history, the idea that we're going to see inflation or rising prices. Again, this has never happened in Europe. And now it's happening as a result of silver. In other words, the availability of the silver pouring into Europe. Again, and at some point, because the Europeans are buying products from Asia, particularly China, things like silks, ceramics, and the like, China will be the major recipient of American silver. Again, the European trading companies move into Asia, and then they bring silver with them, and they buy spices, teas, and silks, and ceramics, And eventually, all this silver will now move to Asia as well. So this is also going to monetize China. China will adopt silver as the primary currency as well of the kingdom. Again, just like Europe as well. So again, although this is really flooding the market in Europe and leading to a price revolution, eventually over time, most of the silver ended up in China, as we move into the 17 and 1800s. Again, all of this American silver actually is ending up in China as well. The slave trade. Okay, so there's also another impact in the slave trade. The slave trade with West Africa is going to increase violence in Africa proper and also social disruptions. Okay, there'll be more warfare because the kingdoms are receiving weaponry from the Europeans to engage in raids of communities. And as the West African kingdoms are pursuing more and more populations, they're disrupting communities and villages deep into the mainland of Africa. Again, so this is one of the consequences, again, of the slave trade. So instead of just, capturing war captives, the ways that Africans have done in the past, how people were turning to slaves? Well, from wars. Whenever there was a war, those people that were captured, the prisoners of war, were turned into, slaves. But now, the West African kingdoms like Congo, for example, Senegal, Ashanti, and so on, what they're doing is that they're just conducting open raids. They're not really waging war. They're just raiding against communities and capturing entire communities, and then sending them to the coastline to be shipped again to America as well, which leads to a shift in power in Africa. What we see is that the power centers of Africa are moving away from the mainland, like the Kingdom of Mali that we examined in the past. Again, they're moving now to the coastline. Again, the coastal kingdoms are now emerging as the major centers of power in Africa, in West Africa. In this case, those kings are building up their own personal armies made up of slaves. So they have their own personal armies, and they're made up of slaves, and they are adopting also European-style enterprises like plantations, for example. They're building their own plantations in West Africa to feed their armies. They're growing things like corn, for example, to feed their soldiers and the like. Again, so there is, of course, significant change taking place in Africa, as a result of the slave trade. Now, other changes include also new forms of Christianity, native forms. For example, in the New World, as the Spanish, French, or British are converting the Native American population to Christianity, although some Native Americans do convert, what is happening here is that they're giving rise to a new form of Christianity, a more Amerindian form of Christianity, in which the conversion is not 100% pure. They do convert, but the conversion is more syncretic in that the Christian deities like Virgin Mary, for example, and Jesus are the new face of the old Native American gods. For example, the Virgin Mary was associated with the Earth Mother, the Earth Goddess that the natives prayed to, for example, the mother of all people that blesses humans with crops and health, for example. And Jesus is associated with the sun god as well. So they do convert. But in reality, what we're seeing here is that they are interpreting the European religion according to their own logic, according to their own system. The same in West Africa. We saw, for example, the creation of a Catholic church in the Kingdom of Congo. And although the people of Congo undergo conversion, they're creating their own version of Christianity that is very Africanized as well. It's an African Christianity in which, for example, the Bible and the church itself were considered like charms, for example, like a fetish, for example. Okay, those were objects of power that contain magic. You can cast out demons with them. You can protect yourself. The way in Africa people carry, of course, those religious objects like a talisman, for example, and so on, in order to protect themselves. Again, even the church was considered to be animated and full of magic as well. Okay, a magical, object as well. The Catholic saints, for example, were considered to be the local spiritual entities that people pray to, and also ancestor spirits, that many of the saints and the virgins that people are praying to in Congo are considered to be really just new faces of their old gods, their old African gods, that govern the natural environment, or deceased family members that passed away and that continue to bless the family from the other world. The other very important change that we're going to see here is demographic change in America. As a result of the Great Dying, as I explained, there's going to be a massive outpouring of African slaves into the New World. So what we see is that in America, we're going to see the rise of an African population, particularly in the locations that were the major recipients of African slaves, like the Caribbean islands. Think of, for example, Cuba, Puerto Rico, for example, Jamaica, Haiti, and Dominican Republic, for example, just to give you a handful of examples. And again, this African population, in Brazil, South America, are going to bring in with them their own local African traditions, food cultures, music, dance. And so it's not just the population, it's also, again, a very vibrant and very dynamic also African culture is on the rise. That is hybrid. It mixes African elements with European elements as well. And this is what is called Afro-Creole. Afro-Creole, again, is a blend of, again, African traditions with European traditions as well. Okay? And we have, of course, mestizos. Mestizos is really a population that is a mixture of indigenous Native American with European, particularly, Spanish. Mexico is the classic example of this. Again, that the vast majority of the peoples of Mexico are mestizos. They have both Spanish and Native American ancestry. So there is really a new population makeup. Of course, after 1650, the population in the New World recovered. The Native American population recovered. And so the indigenous population is also on the rise, starting around 1650, and it will recover to the previous levels before the Great Dying, the Great Catastrophe. Okay? Now, the summary points, what we have covered in this topic titled The Rise of the Trading Empires. We covered a series of trading empires, again, about 8 of them, which in reality were really new kinds of entities. There were new kinds of economic and military entities, again, that are on the rise. They have very, very large economies as a result of their trading operations that extend their tentacles in different parts of the world. This is something that has not been achieved in the past. So this is unprecedented, in other words. Again, and they are indeed creating trade monopolies. This is very important. Trade monopolies, again, is part of the process of expansion around the world. And those monopolistic systems that they implement lead to smuggling and piracy. So this phenomenon around the world about, smuggling and piracy was really the effect of those trading empires. As they were trying to dominate trade and the trade networks and control them, we're going to see, of course, people trying to circumvent or attack, again, those monopolies, again, in that way. The interaction of empires, again, what we see is that as those trading empires move into different areas of the globe, they're engaging in different kinds of negotiations and accommodations with the trading partners, whether those were Native Americans, for example, in North America, those or in Southeast Asia, for example, or in China Sea, or in the Indian Ocean, or in West Africa. Of course, there is certain deals, again, or arrangements that those empires are making, again, as they're making contact with other cultures and other societies. Again, that involves, in some cases, alliances, trading, for example, weaponry or merchandise in order to build the alliance, the commercial partnership as well. Sometimes that entailed conquest and violence, the way we saw it with the Spanish, for example, against the Aztecs and the Incas, or what we saw with the Dutch in the Spice Islands, of course, when they were trying to displace people and, in many cases, annihilate people as well. because of the overproduction, for example. In West Africa, we see, of course, disruptions. Because of the violence in the slave trade, we see major disruptions in communities and societies and villages in West Africa as well. We see also the process of religious conversion. Again, that certain societies convert out of expediency, or the trading empires engage very actively in trying to convert, again, other societies in order to bring them into the system. In other words, we saw that with the Spanish, we saw that with the British, the French in North America, again, religious conversion. Once again, this is overall leading to more and more economic integration and cultural change. The integration of economies, Europe, West Africa, and America. Again, because of the slave trade, for example, the silver trade as well is really monetizing Europe and connecting the European economy with China. Again, because of silver as well. Again, so there is significant, of course, change, integration on an economic and also cultural level. And this is really setting the stage for a whole new era. Again, is the era of modernity. This is all I have for you. And coming next, we're going to be moving into, of course, the age of revolutions that are going to actually initiate the modern world. Okay, I'll announce that when we come back. Thank you.